Madad. My name is Hamida, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that seek to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of their land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We do this to express gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside on, and to honor the Indigenous people who have been living with and caring for their lands from time immemorial. Recognizing them also means acknowledging the historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the way in which we benefit from and perpetuate violence towards Indigenous peoples. Naming the original and current stewards of the land we live on is the first step towards making reparations. I reside in Birmingham, Alabama, stewarded historically and currently by the Muskogee Creek peoples. We believe the work we do in sessions like these is part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge and address the ongoing harm to Indigenous peoples. Our work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. During our session today, we will explore the nature of astrophysics, how it can lead us to learn about the cosmos and our place in it, and how faith can be a conduit to encourage us to search, find, and learn more about Allah and Allah's creation. During this session, you will see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, I'm honored to introduce you to our wonderful speaker today for our session, Dr. Arif Babul. Dr. Arif Babul is a University of Victoria Distinguished Professor at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. He was born in Mabanza, Tanzania, and grew up in Toronto, Canada. He received his Bachelor's of Applied Science in Engineering Sciences, specializing in physics and aerospace from the University of Toronto, and did a PhD in astrophysics at Princeton University. Professor Babul is a theorist who, over the course of his career, has made a number of groundbreaking contributions to the field of physical cosmology, the study of how galaxies and other observed structures in the universe formed. He has been interviewed about his work on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's renowned Quarks and Quark radio program and appeared on the BBC World Series, The Forum. He has received many awards and honors, including the Kavli Frontiers Science Fellowship, a NATO Science Fellowship held at the University of Cambridge, the Liverhome Visiting Fellowship at Universities of Oxford and Durham, a Lagrange Institute Visiting Fellowship at the Institute of Astrophysics in Paris, a Poly Center Fellowship, and a Gast Professorship at the University of Zurich, and he holds the only distinguished professorship in the Faculty of Science at the University of Victoria. Professor Babul has given several acclaimed public lectures on astronomy and the mysterious universe, including the Ismaili Center Dubai and to the various chapters of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Professor Babul also given lectures and published an essay on the relationship between faith and science within the Islamic context. He has a strong interest in the history of science and the relationship between faith and science during the Islamic Golden Age, and is the author of 2 book reviews on the subject. Prior to the pandemic, Professor Babul was the lead organizer and the host of the Ismaili Center Canada public lecture series in science and technology. Before we dive in, I'd just like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Now let's turn to our conversation. As we begin, we would be eager to hear more about what you do. What does your work entail, and can you share more about the field of astrophysics and your research, Dr. Babul?
Hamida, I hope you can hear me.
Absolutely, we hear you perfectly.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. I have heard a lot about this conversation. It's certainly been making ripples amongst my colleagues. So thank you. To answer your question, I think it might be easier if I start by showing a series of slides, 5 or 6 of them. I think it'll put some of the stuff that I think about in context, and it'll give your audience a visual to sort of focus on.
That sounds amazing.
Now, I am, there's usually a diverse audience in forums like this. So let me start with, at least let me start at the very beginning, or at least at the very basic. So if we were to look up at the night sky, we would see the moon, we would see some planets, and we would see a lot of stars, especially if you're in a dark area like the Yellowstone National Park. But you would also, if you look carefully, see a fuzzy band running across the entire sky. And this fuzzy band happens to be the galaxy that we live in. It's fuzzy because it is that within this band are roughly about 100 billion stars that make up our galaxy. All the other stars that we see in the sky are relatively nearby. They are within our own neighborhood. So we happen to be in a galaxy called the Milky Way. Our sun is one of, as I said, 100 billion stars. Now, if I go one step beyond that, and I look at the Milky Way band again, and here is another picture of that, and you can see the Milky Way in the sky. Amongst the stars, there are objects that appear fuzzy. A few of them that we can see by naked eye would appear fuzzy. There is the most famous of these is the Andromeda galaxy. It is the nearest galaxy to our own. You can see the picture that's been taken through a telescope of the Andromeda galaxy. It's our sister galaxy. And of course, the work that I do actually focuses on the galaxies per se. So it is the galaxies that are spread out throughout the cosmos. We know that our universe is about 13.8 billion years old. It hosts, as far as we have been able to measure, 250 billion galaxies, but that's a lower limit. There are way more galaxies than that. And we have managed to make an incredibly detailed map of galaxies going back 7 billion years in time. So what you're seeing there, that animated GIF, every dot on that animated GIF is a galaxy. If you look carefully, you'll see that they are not spread out randomly. There is structure. There are filaments and gaps and voids and walls. Galaxies are not just spread across the cosmos willy-nilly. And trying to understand that structure is one of the tasks that astrophysicists like me have undertake. Just to take this a little further, the Hubble Space Telescope has allowed us to drill back to roughly when the universe was about 1 billion years old. So already there's an idea here that I would like you to keep in mind, that telescopes are like time machines. Every time we looked at the sky, we're actually looking at things that existed way back in the past. It's just that it's taken light some time to reach us. And if you look at the Hubble Space Telescope and you magnify it, you see that there are galaxies present even about 1 billion years after the Big Bang. Some of them look somewhat bizarre. If you have been following astronomy recently, you may have heard in the news about the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope that happened over Christmas Day. It's reached its orbit now. It's unpacking itself. Most of it is almost finished. the telescope is about to, will soon be taking first flight. James Webb Space Telescope will enable us to peer back to when the universe was 200 million years old. So it will penetrate into this regime that's on the visual is marked as the Dark Ages. This is when we think the first stars and the first galaxies started to form. The furthest we can look back is when the universe was about 400,000 years old. And we see ripples, and you can see that as hot blue and red spots on this map here. This is the afterglow of the Big Bang, and the ripples show us what the nature and the character of the universe was back at 400,000 years old. Friends of mine who have participated in taking this image like to call this the baby picture of the universe. These ripples are amplified by gravity over time, and they eventually turn into galaxies that we see today. So with that in mind, let me tell you what astrophysicists like myself do. We start with these ripples, and then we use very powerful supercomputers, and we watch as physics plays out on these supercomputers. We're literally modeling the evolution of the universe over the course of 14 billion years. And this particular movie was not made by my group. It was made by a group collaboration known as Illustrious. They had resources to make this fantastic movie. And I thought I'd take it and show it to you. What you're seeing here is the ripples that was in the last map are growing over time as gravity plays out its magic. And as material collapses, you see these filaments and empty regions. And at the intersections of the filament, you'll be seeing these orange spots. If you look carefully, you'll see these orange spots are actually in places exploding. These are stars starting to form. Black holes are playing out are doing their thing. They are accepting a lot of material. They're pumping out tremendous amount of energy and impacting regions of space that extends well beyond the galaxy itself. Simulations like this allow us to test our ideas of how the universe has evolved. We compare the final results that come out of these simulations against observations. And in that way, we iterate back and forth and try and get a sense of the universe, its history, its evolution, and its dynamics. So that was just a very short introduction to a little bit about what we know and a little bit about how we go about knowing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babul. This is all really interesting. And thank you for sharing these wonderful images with our audience today. I would like to ask you about the beginning of time. How close are we to understanding the beginning of time from a scientific point of view?
So I think that to answer that question, it may actually help your audience if I put up one more visual. So, and this is a visual that's usually called the timeline of the universe. It sort of sketches out the different epochs in the history of the universe. On the left-hand side, you see the epochs written out. I'm not going to go through them in detail. On the right-hand side, you see the telescopes that I just referred to. So you have the Hubble Space Telescope that allows us to peer back to when the universe was about 1 billion years old. And I said that the James Webb Space Telescope will take us back to when the universe was about 200 million years old. And the cosmic microwave background, the baby picture of the universe that we've been able to take, allows us to go back to roughly about 400,000 years. But beyond 400,000 years, we are now starting to enter a regime where at least direct observations are not possible. So the first squiggly bar here, which runs from about 400,000 years, roughly to a fraction of a second after the Big Bang, is a regime I would say that we have a pretty good handle on. There are physics playing out there whose imprints, repercussions, are measurable today. So indirect observations allow us to get a handle on the state of the universe back then than the physics that was playing out. So that's about a fraction of a second. And then my particle physics colleagues used very powerful machines like the CERN Hadron Colliders to explore the fundamental physics of forces that govern the universe and of matter that makes up the universe. And the physics that they have uncovered, if you extrapolate that back to the past history of the universe, allows us to get back to roughly about a nanosecond after the Big Bang, or in some instances, my colleagues would even argue a picosecond. So we're talking about a billionth of a second or a 1,000 billionth of a second after the Big Bang. And at that point, I would say that we are in sort of theoretical territory where some things are well established and some things are still up in the air. But then once you get past that, we run into what most of us will admit is speculative physics. We are pushing the limits of the physics that we know itself. And so beyond about a picosecond, we are in a regime where we are not, I wouldn't put my house up for sale based on what we know back at that particular epoch. And then going right back to the origin of Big Bang, the question starts, what caused the Big Bang? What caused the very fabric of space and time in our universe to start forming? Because we know the universe is expanding. As it expands, it creates space, it creates time. So what is it that caused that? And there are several different ideas about that, one of which involves the fact that there are many, many universes that are constantly frothing. And another one talks about the fact that our own universe will collapse, bounce, and then expand again and collapse, and it'll go through these cycles. Which one of these models is right? There have made predictions, and we're hoping that telescopes in Antarctica that are just being refurbished and in fact improved to take certain observations will give us a hint. So let me stop there. I think that that's a lot of ideas to think about for somebody who hasn't come across this. But we do talk about the creation of space and time and matter and energy. And the Big Bang involves bringing all of that into being.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. You've also talked about and written extensively on the topic of science and faith. Some people might think that science and faith are in conflict with each other. Why do you think that is?
So, there are the regular, the normal ways of people engaging with science, between science and religion, and coming up with these conclusions of conflict usually hinges on sort of two aspects, if you will. I mean, there are many, but two are sort of important. One is that we think about the origin stories in the religious texts. And if you take those origin stories literally, then there's a clear and obvious conflict. If some biblical scholars have taken the story of Genesis, they worked back out through the generations and estimated that the world formed in, I think, September 9th, 4004 BC. Well, that doesn't quite run with the 14 billion year history of the universe that I've just described. So there are clear and obvious conflicts if you take things that are in religious texts literally. And that refers back not just to the Big Bang, but it also refers back to the creation of humankind itself. So when I talk about origin stories, those are the obvious tension points. There is another issue that often comes up. It's a little bit more subtle one. It's a question of faith. Do I take things on faith? I can't prove God. So Does that mean I abandon this particular principle? I think that anybody who argues that everything must be empirically demonstrated has not either understood science, or for that matter, has not understood or fails to understand how human beings function in and of itself. So let me first talk about, from a neuroscience perspective. My wife is a neuroscientist. She would tell you that as we take in information from our environment, we're being bombarded with thousands upon thousands of bits of information. There's no way your brain has the computing power to factor all of that in. So already we have a framework that we have constructed within our head that on basis of faith, on assumptions, on axioms, we discard certain informations and we will give priority to other information. We live our life by doing this. We are constantly making assumptions. But let me turn to science, because I think that is something that people are much more interested in. I was in a discussion in France. I was at a conference. I was sitting across from a French physicist. He discovered that I was Muslim, and he started to question. It started out as a conversation which says, I don't understand people who believe in God. You can't prove God. Why do you even think about this? And I listened him out and I say, you and I work on the Big Bang. So what are we doing? We are taking physics and physical laws that we discover here and now and using those, assuming that those laws apply over the entire 14 billion history of the universe. That as far back as we can go, I'm assuming that those laws of physics are eternal, that they are universal, they cut across space. What is true here is true also on the other side of the galaxy. How do you prove this? I don't know of anybody who can go back in time and demonstrate that that is true. That is an article of faith within physics, within cosmology, within biology. If you think about the origin stories, you are starting with the assumption that the physics that I believe in here, that we discover here and now, holds true everywhere and at every time. This is something that people don't generally think about. But almost every endeavor, take geometry, the most mathematics, very logical. You still have to start with axioms. Can you prove Euclid's axioms? No, that's the whole point. They are axioms. You can prove everything else, but they always reference back to the axioms. So the idea that I have to prove everything is itself problematic. So, it depends on how you engage and at what level you wish to engage. If you wish to take a literal perspective, yeah, there's a conflict. If you happen, to have a different perspective, then it becomes a much more interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babul. How does the worldview in which we are raised impact the way we see this conflict between science and faith?
So I think that exactly what you said, the words that you used are spot on. The worldview we are raised in. So I have come across people, of different faiths, even within Ismailism. And in fact, my own cousins will meet me. I remember one occasion when I met a cousin of mine in Jamaica, and I hadn't seen her in a long time. She asked me, "What do I do?" And I said, "I study the Big Bang." And she said, "I believe in God," and walked off. And that was it. That conversation ended right there. So, we have that approach, and that was the worldview that she had grown up in, and that worldview was in direct tension with whatever she presumed I was doing. On the other hand, the worldview that I grew up in, much thanks to my mother and father, was one where we sat around the dinner table, and it was particularly my dad who encouraged this. He would encourage me to challenge him. He would state some things, and then we would have a discussion. And if I had questions that pushed him to the edge of comfort, I could see him getting uncomfortable, but he wouldn't discourage me. And, he would open doors. He would show me literature. I got to read Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah's various speeches. One of the things we often talk about is intercession and miracles within religious contexts. And he gave me this text. It's a mission conference speech by Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah, where he was asked by one of the Al-Waises, what are we to make of all these miracles that are described in the Ginanic tradition and in various other literature? And Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah said that supernatural acts of Hazrat Ali and Pir Sadruddin should be understood as purely allegorical. Now, so when you come across that kind of literature, and when you're exposed to those kinds of ideas very early on, you start to sort of develop a very different way of engaging with religious texts and religious ideas. They become parables, they become allegories. And Hazar Imam has talked about that when he opened the conference on the Quran at the Institute for Ismaili Studies many years ago. He talked about richness of allegories and parables in the Quran, and how it's a blessing that empowers humankind to read, engage, and even come up with multiple interpretations. I'll just finish up with one thought on that, which will be another food for thought. There is a ayat in the Quran, Surah 39, I believe, verse 15 or 16, which says something to the effect that give good tidings to my servants who listen to the word and take the best part of it. Right? Think about the second half, and take the best part. What does that mean? What is it? So does that mean the Quranic, the Quranic text has things that are better and then best, and we are supposed to unpack that? And that, that in itself is a search. So in that sense, it's not very different from the kind of search I undertake.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. Then would you say that the curiosity and asking questions, does it resonate with the practice of our faith?
Again, if you go back in Ismaili history, that was part and parcel of who we were as a people and as a community. We were, if you look at the imams and the activities that they had were patrons of, they sponsored scientists, they sponsored philosophers, people who were asking questions, continuously trying to understand what is it that we know, how do we know, and how do we establish that what we know is correct? That in itself is a dialogue. It also means that nothing in that sense is immutable other than the core principles. It is our responsibility at that point to dig into, whether you talk about nature, or you talk about the religious texts, or you talk about your own spirituality or your own mind for that matter, and query, where do you stand? And engaging with questions, uncomfortable questions, is part and parcel of who we are supposed to be as Ismailis. This is the intellectual tradition that the Imam talks about. Yes, it can be uncomfortable. And, I would be the first person to admit that as I think about these things, about what I do, what I discover, what my faith tells me, there are places where you run into paradoxes or you run into tensions, and you have to learn to think it through and unpack it. And, I think maybe it's easier for me as a scientist because I'm constantly living at the edge of the unknown. Half the things I don't know. The universe is crazy, bizarre, and new things pop up all the time. So, maybe we're not, we're trained to think about these things and trained to deal with it and accept it. But I think that is what intellectual search really does come down to. And I was joking with somebody earlier that if the universe, life, and everything was simple, it would be no fun. And they said, well, I don't think lots of people would be happy to engage in uncomfortable questions. I can appreciate that, but taking a dogmatic perspective is also a problem in its own right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babul. Earlier, you spoke about literalism, and in your essay on faith and science, you also mentioned the term creative literalism when exploring and interpreting the Quran. Can you share more about this term and how it impacts others who engage in the practice of our faith?
Yeah, so creative literalism has been the new response, at least within Islam. It involves taking verses from the Quran and then not just reinterpreting them, but often stretching their interpretation so as to fit modern science. So if you go on the internet and you look, you Google Quran and the Big Bang, you'll see that there'll be websites that'll tell you that the Big Bang was predicted by the Quran, and then there are many questions that suddenly pop up in your head. If all of these things are there, why did a Muslim not discover them? Right. So it can't be that simple. The other thing is, and it's a much more fundamental problem, is that as a scientist, I know that half of what I know, maybe more, is wrong because it's constantly being revised. This is the whole thing about science. We are adversarial. We're challenging ourselves. My colleagues are challenging me. We're constantly having to justify what we think and what we believe, and within the framework of science. But they are all open to revision, and revision is part and parcel of science. If you link Quran that literally to the scientific worldview of today, what happens if scientists tomorrow come along and say, no, I don't think Big Bang is right. It was some delusional theory of people from the 20th century, and now we have a much better thing. Are we then suddenly going to say, oh, okay, well, let me redefine everything and start, from scratch? I think that this response, and I think in my essay I mentioned I was sent, this is something that happens all the time, I was sent a picture from the Hubble Space Telescope that said, beautiful picture, rose-colored nebulae, says this nebula is described in the Quran. And they quote the verse from the Quran. It was an oily, rose-like nebulae in the sky. You go and look at the verse, and it's talking about the day of judgment. That when you see this in the sky, the day of judgment is upon us. And I'm looking outside, and okay, I live in Vancouver. It's raining. It's miserable, but it doesn't look like the end of days. So, what is it that we're trying to do? I think this is partly born of insecurity, to be honest. And, we're so busy trying to justify our faith from a perspective that it has no relationship to. In a way, we're trying to ground it in science, but we're doing disservice to both the science and faith at the same time. I see this playing out in Jama'khanas when all-wises will come and say, neuroscientists are telling you that, if you meditate, your brain will change. I don't know. Every time I look at a screen, I receive information, my brain is changing. If you're studying constantly and asking questions and using your brain structures are different from somebody who doesn't do this. It's sort of an established truth that, people who have advanced degrees have more myelin in their brain. Is this something fantastic? No, it's just saying that if I was doing exercises and I was doing strength training, I would be strengthening one particular types of muscles. And if I was doing endurance training, I would be strengthening a different type of muscles. Is this somehow such a mind-blowing idea that you would use that to prove something? It just doesn't work. We have to stop being insecure about these things and ask a deeper question, which is beyond the superficial. What role does faith play in human beings' life?
Thank you, Dr. Babul. What advice would you give to those who engage in science as a way to further explore the divine?
I think that there's symbolism and allegories in within the world of science that reverberates and is in many ways is in sync with what I see as an article of faith, or at least within my own spirituality. Let me give you an example. We physicists, we know that the world is governed by four forces. And if you go back in time, those forces start to sort of fuse into each other. So you go from 4 to 3 forces as we go back in time, the universe is getting hotter. The 3 forces will fuse into 2 forces, and eventually all of those forces will fuse into 1. Similarly with matter, which dominates our world, if you go back in time, you reduce the number of diversity in matter particles and eventually end up with 1. And so physicists are always talking about this concept of grand unification, this principle that encompasses all, or when we're jokingly, when we're talking about this in a joking sense, people will often cite The Hobbit and talk about the ring that binds it all. You're talking about a principle, a unifying principle. And if you think about it from the other perspective, this unifying principle over the course of universe's 14 billion year history has reverberated and reflected to create this plurality of the world that we live in. I think that's a fantastic idea that, from unity, there comes diversity and plurality, that there is a link. It also suggests that there is a grand transcendence. I mean, think about it. The universe need not be ordered or harmonious. The laws of nature need not be, need not have an order and work in the way that they do. They could have been completely capricious. And Einstein has a quote to this effect. He said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And that was the root, the root of his spirituality. Einstein did not believe in an anthropomorphic God, but he saw transcendence within the universe. And he's even quoted as saying, he was asked, why do you do what you do? And he says, I want to know God's mind. Everything else is irrelevant. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the phrase that he used. For him, looking out at the universe and looking deep past the physical and seeing the underlying transcendence was a spiritual experience. The same was true for Newton. The same was true for Kepler. The same was true for Nasiruddin Tusi or Ibn Haytham. They talk about these things and they engaged with science as scientists. The scientific method that scientists use today was developed in its current form by Ibn al-Haytham. And it was all part of this idea of how do I know? What do I know? How many different kinds of knowledge there are? If there was only one and it was a revelatory knowledge, then game is over, right? All these questions are meaningless, but it's not. The Quran itself talks about looking at nature and asking questions. Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah, in his open letter he wrote, What Have We Forgotten in Islam?, talks about the fact that the only miracle in Islam is the law and order and harmony in nature. Okay, so then I feel like I have this unique opportunity to explore this order and harmony and see or glimpse this transcendence from one perspective. So that's kind of fun, right? I get to do in many ways what my faith encourages me to do, and I have the liberty to do it. And I get often on those rare occasions an opportunity to glimpse it.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. You also talk about the essence of Islam, this core spiritual and ethical vision of Islam. Can you tell us a bit more about it and how this can be used as a trampoline for intellectual growth, innovation, and understanding the universe?
Yeah, so I think all this time I've talked about synchrony between what I do as a scientist and my spiritual outlook. I think that as you move away from the external to the internal, the faith aspect takes on a greater and greater role. I mean, at the very first level, my faith gives me, and I do not believe in direct intercession. I do not believe that if I was standing there and somebody fires a bullet and I start reciting a prayer, that the bullet is suddenly going to turn. That would violate the laws of physics as I know it. And that would be problematic for me on many levels. But my religion, my faith, my spirituality gives me a centering. I know that the world is not always going to be a happy place, that sometimes we are caught in whirls of storm. How do we weather that? How do we stand in the middle of a storm and survive? My faith, my spirituality gives me a sense of strength. It gives me hope. It allows me to withstand the slings and arrows, if you will. And that is just as important an aspect of being a human being and living this life. It also gives me a worldview. It gives me a sense of, it gives me a framework of ethics on which to function on. And, we have many different ways of defining ethics. My religion, my faith gives me a framework of ethics that I find fits and gives me a sense of satisfaction. It gives me a sense of purpose and meaning. And, for example, we are encouraged to stand up for social justice. And so, what do we do when we are encouraged to stand up for social justice and we look around in our own backyard? Forget about the rest of the world. We look around in our own backyard and we find socioeconomic injustice permeating our society. We see racism permeating our society. Are we supposed to do nothing and turn a blind eye? I don't think so. I think that our faith encourages us to engage. We are supposed to be the agents of change. We often talk in religion about God being an intercession, intervening in human affairs. I don't think that's, at least personally, I don't think that's how it works. I think we are the agents through which the divine acts. So if I don't act, the framework of social justice that I believe in and have anchored myself in is meaningless. And so that is one way that my framework, my sense of my spirituality and my faith informs my world. And there is no way to prove, I have to reinforce this, there's no way to prove which ethical framework is the right one. Philosophers have been debating this for centuries, but it is the one that fits. It is the one that gives me a sense of, as I said, satisfaction. Helping somebody gives me a sense of fulfillment. It gives my life a sense of meaning. And that's an intersection that is equally important to me as my science is.
Thank you, Dr. Babul, for these very reflective thoughts. I'm sure our audience enjoyed learning about and exploring the universe with us, as well as contemplating the relationship between science and faith, which we have learned today can be quite complex. Dr. Babul has highlighted for us that Islam is in fact not monolithic and that there are a plurality of interpretations within our Ummah. He has also taken us on a journey into one of the ways of interpreting the Holy Scripture. He advises our young Murids that stories in the Quran are rich in metaphors and allegories and not to be confused with theories of the origin of the universe, such as the Big Bang. Our Ismaili identity then propels us in the direction of exploring the divine by engaging with the natural world, fueling our curiosity, asking questions, and utilizing the scientific method to understand Allah's creation. With everything that's been spoken about, we have received many questions from our audience, which we would love to hear your insights on. With that, let's turn to our first question. What does time being created mean? And how do you reconcile time as a non-linear vector and the idea of a 14 billion year span?
I'm not sure what a non-linear vector means. I'm not sure what the person asking the question is referring to. As far as time having an origin, we, from Einstein's theory of general relativity, we have understood that the very fabric of space itself that we live on, this universe, and the time that is governing this universe had a beginning. There was a point at which t equals 0. And in terms of geometry, people often discuss or draw out what that means. To go beyond that would probably take a little longer than a few minutes that I have. But I'd be happy to engage with the person asking the question, offline. And if they explain their question a little bit more, maybe I can come up with a more sensible answer, a more satisfactory answer.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. Can you tell us about how our understanding of how the universe was created has evolved starting from Newton to where we are today? And to what extent does Newtonian physics still guide your research interests?
Yeah, so I think that early on, the view of the world used to be that the universe was static, that the world sort of existed. It's always been there. It's governed by Newtonian physics, and that changed with Einstein. Einstein's theory of relativity, particularly general relativity, gave rise to a new model for the universe, which then made predictions like the afterglow of the Big Bang, and the discovery of the afterglow of the Big Bang, the discovery of the fact that galaxies are, for the most part, moving away from us, and they're moving away from us uniformly in every direction. So there is an expansion to the universe. The easy way to think about this is if you take a balloon and you draw little dots on it with a marker and you blow into the balloon, you will notice that each dot will move away from every other dot. It's not that the dots are moving, right? Because marker dots don't move by themselves, but the balloon surface is expanding. And if you happen to be sitting on one of those dots and looking around, you'll see every other dot moving away, almost proportionate to the distance. So they will be moving away. Further you are, the faster they move away. This is the Hubble law that we're talking about, after whom the Hubble Space Telescope was named. That conception is grounded in this idea of gravity. So Newton did not discuss what gravity is. Newton wrote down an equation that described how gravity behaved. Einstein's theory of relativity starts to query what is gravity. And in doing so, he found that the Newtonian physics fails at certain regimes. When you are in a regime of very strong gravity, like around black holes, it fails. To what extent do I use Newtonian mechanics? For the most part, we continue to use Newtonian mechanics until we're dealing with black holes, or we're dealing with the very beginnings of the universe, or we're dealing with the universe on the grandest scale. But if I'm looking at planets around stars, or I'm looking at gas on a planet and trying to figure out, is there signatures of life on there? Or I'm dealing with our galaxy and its neighboring galaxy and asking, how are they moving? Or I'm shooting pool. Newtonian mechanics is just fine. If I was sending rockets to the moon, I don't need Einstein, I need Newton. It's a simpler prescription, but fairly accurate for the most part in the world that we live in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babul. My next question is, can you use the scientific method to gain an understanding of your faith? And if so, how?
Yeah, so I think that we have to understand the relationship between faith. When you say, can I use science to gain an understanding of my faith? The question is, what is meant by that? One way to interpret that is to say, can I prove my faith? And the answer is no, I cannot. As I mentioned during the course of my talk, much of what we do as human beings is governed by axioms that we adopt. and everything else flows from those axioms. In fact, sometimes we don't even follow those axioms, which is why human beings are often referred to as being irrational. But a rational creature would take the axioms and live their life according to those axioms. But axioms have to be accepted at some level. And so the question really comes down to which aspects of faith, where is the resonance, where is the meeting point? Do you see tension? If you see tension, then of course you have to sit and ask yourself, where is the source of tension? How do I resolve this tension? How can I understand problems? If I grew up thinking that, that whatever deity that you prefer to think of as God, literally sort of, a man or a woman sitting on a throne, took a piece of clay and shaped it into a figure of a human being and called that Adam and then eventually Eve. If you believe in that, then there's a problem. I don't see how you would reconcile one with the other. So it is always a dialogue between the two. It's not a two. I don't see it as distinct. I see my scientist self and my smiley self as a whole. And they are constantly, every aspect of myself are constantly in a dialogue with each other, whether it's, social ethics, whether it's ethics, or whether it's spirituality, or whether it's an experiential discovery of something that for a minute blows you away. We tend to compartmentalize this, but I think sitting on a beach, watching a spectacular sunset and being moved by it is a spiritual experience. Looking out on a rainy day and seeing a rainbow suddenly break out evokes multiple responses. On one hand, there's this marvel that takes your breath away. On the other hand, I can see in my head how exactly the rainbow is forming. So does that mean that I have to separate these two and reconcile? No, I don't.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babul. Many scriptures state that the existence of humankind is the highest form of creation. What are your thoughts on or expertise in the universal laws, such as last of vibration? Do you believe us humans have the ability to connect with the universe and attract the energy into our lives?
So I think that's an interesting question. So are human beings sort of the apex of creation? That in itself is a rich topic that can be expanded upon. So, in the very first part of the what am I trying to say? In the very first part of the dua, we recite Surat al-Fatiha, and in the very first few verses, we talk about Lord of the worlds, not just worlds. And there is an interesting story, a discussion. I just wrote a book review on Islam and life in outer space. And there was I came across an interesting discussion by Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, who talks about the fact that do not think that we are the only beings in this universe. There are worlds out there with populated. And so that already opens up the question of are there aliens out there and life in outer space, and what is our place in it? So that already asks the question: are we somehow special, or are we just one of many who exist in this fantastic creation that is there? We know that there are planets around nearly every star. And the chances of there being Earth-like planets are increasing every day as my colleagues who are studying exoplanets keep finding new and new solar systems with Earth-like candidates. So I think it's a matter of time before we run across that kind of thing. But let's turn around to human beings. It's interesting to even contemplate the fact that we ourselves are accidents. Even on Earth, life on Earth started about 3.5 billion years ago and has undergone, I believe it's about 4 or 5 major extinctions where 99% of life was virtually wiped out. So if you go back just a few, a million years, you would have said that the apex creatures on Earth were dinosaurs. And then along came a comet that wiped them, an asteroid that wiped them out. And we are here, but for the grace of that accident. So, does that make us special? I'm not sure that it is human beings that are special. I think it's the idea of creatures who are cognizant, conscious, and able to engage in an intellectual search and query their surroundings, try and understand who they are, where, what is their place in this grand scheme of things. It is this idea of, consciousness is a good word. It's self-consciousness. Are we unique in that? I have no idea.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. Our next question is, many scriptures state that the existence of humankind is the highest form of creation. What are your thoughts and expertise? Oh, I think we've already done this. Sorry about that. My inquiry is related to limits of empiricism and how perhaps the unknown past the limits of empiricism is where faith proceeds and informs our lives. Curious if, I guess our audience is curious if historical or contemporary Muslim scientists have informed us of this paradigm and if the paradigm is of any value.
I haven't come across a discussion of that particular paradigm in my readings of Muslim scientists like Tusi and Al-Haytham, the two that I've actually focused on quite a bit. I have come across this kind of a paradigm amongst European scientists, and it's known as God of gaps. And I'm particularly leery of that at some level. God of gaps is an idea that when you reach the boundaries of your present day knowledge, you fill it in with God. So, if you think about it, in the old days, before we knew about gravity, the question was, how does the planets move around the Earth? And the idea was that, an angel or was there pushing it along in its orbit. Until gravity and angular momentum conservation was discovered. And then it sort of became blasé, if you will, just run-of-the-mill physics. And so when we talk about the limits of empiricism, first of all, I'm not entirely sure what that even means, because what I can't discover today, there's a pretty good chance we'll discover tomorrow. Instruments, technologies improving. We couldn't build telescopes as powerful as we have today, even 100 years ago. And now we have discovered things about the universe that we would have not even imagined 100 years ago. So what does that mean about limits of empiricism? I think that it's a grand challenge, and we have to remain in a constant state of conversation, back and forth. It's as much for scientists to question their views of the world as it is for people who are engaging with religious texts to question their views. Remember that verse I just brought up earlier that says, "Give my good tidings to people who listen to the word and take the best of it." Well, what does that mean? And that is a statement of engagement. There is a professor that visited University of Victoria, I guess it was about 20 years ago. We had him come for a Milad lecture. And he spoke about the very first revelation, which starts out with, Ikra, recite. And he said that one of the ways to understand that, and the way it has been understood in the past, is that was a demand, not just on Muhammad, to recite the Quran and revisit it and re-engage with it, not in a rote way, but literally to think about the context of the verse and the meaning and the and the cultural milieu and the language in which it was being revealed. And as that time was changing, that in itself was supposed to be a way to revisit your interpretations. And so this idea that somehow a text would be immutable and the world will change, or vice versa, are both problematic. I don't know if I've answered the question, but certainly about the limits of empiricism, I am very, very, very leery of, because it's a very problematic idea. What I don't know today, I will probably know tomorrow. Then what? Do I keep pushing God away?
Thank you, Dr. Babul. Our next question is about Galileo. One of the most famous examples of conflict between faith and science was Galileo's conflict with the Christian church around heliocentricity. Do you believe with the passage of time and the greater understanding of science and our own psychology has led us to, our own psychology has led to closer alignment or greater separation with religion in the scientific community? I'm sorry about that. Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I think I got the gist of it. So that question is approaching the relationship between science and religion from a Christian perspective, or specifically a European Christian perspective. Let me turn this around and tell you a little bit about the Islamic relationship. From the very early days of Islam, guided by verses in the Quran that talked about us looking at the natural phenomena in the sky and around us and seeking to understand them, Muslim rulers were patrons of philosophy and mathematics. They had no problems engaging with communities that were not Muslims. In other words, there's a hadith by the Prophet: seek knowledge wherever you can, even if you have to go to China. People like Ibn Battuta and Al-Biruni traveled around. They, got knowledge from India, from China, from Central Asia, and then as all of this knowledge, the Byzantines, the Jewish communities in the Middle East were very prominent in medical sciences. All of that was woven together. People were brought in. They collaborated. There was an explosion of science and mathematics going on at that time, but it wasn't all hunky dory. There were segments of the society that resented this and objected strenuously to this pursuit of knowledge through philosophy and science. And at one point, it came to a clash, and I believe it was Caliph Ma'mun in Baghdad who put down a rebellion of theologians and in fact had people massacred. So it was the opposite. It was the theologians who were intensely suppressed by the rationalists at that time. What we had in the Western world was the opposite, right? Or at least that's the story goes, that there was persecution of the scientists like Bruno, who was burnt at a stake in Rome, or Galileo. But again, it wasn't straightforward and it's simple in that sense. That too was complicated. People who bring up Galileo as an example of attention forget that Galileo's patron were cardinals. People who were in the church were providing him with money to actually do the work he was doing. There, in Galileo's case, the problem was he ran into a political trouble. Galileo had a rather unpleasant character, and he attacked the Pope face on. And, he paid a price for making a strategic miscalculation, a political miscalculation, if you will. This is not to say that there weren't tensions. I think the real tensions with science and religion within the Christian world really came to head with Darwin and the origin of species and how he argued human beings emerged. That really caused a tension. And it was also around that time that the evangelical movement started up in Europe. And it was the evangelists and then this idea of science that created a problem. But if you go back even further, the tension between science and society has always been there. If you look at Mary Shelley and the Romantic era and the Enlightenment era, within literature, forget about religion per se, but even within society, you had people who rejected or were very worried about science taking over all aspects of human society and human character and human perspectives. And so Frankenstein is an example of that. That it's a story about a mad scientist who takes it upon himself to create life, and things go havoc because of that. I'm not sure entirely, but I don't believe Mary Shelley was writing from a religious perspective. There is this constant struggle of trying to understand, if I can describe a rainbow and exactly how light splits to create a rainbow, am I ruining the experience of seeing the rainbow? And I would say no. I don't have a problem, so I'm not sure why anybody else ought to. But it is questions of perspectives, and human beings have had these dilemmas and these tensions that they have lived with, and they go in waves, they come and go. But I don't think it's a problem with one religion per se against one particular person, at least until the 18th century, when things really did start to change. So this tension, to put it in a nutshell, this tension is a product of modernity. It did not exist in previous years, previous centuries.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. You've also organized a public lecture on Islamic astronomy by Professor George Saliba. I believe it was on the influence of Tusi on Copernicus. Are there any Muslim scholars, especially from the golden age of Islam, that you're inspired by or that have helped you with your research?
As I said, I've mentioned Tusi and I've mentioned Ibn al-Haytham. And I have to say that I am, a huge fan of those two. And then there are others like Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni was amongst the first to really promote the heliocentric worldview, the fact that the sun ought to be at the center of the solar system. He did not have any proof. But Tusi developed all the mathematical and the geometric tools that were needed to create a solar system model. Whether it was Earth-centered or sun-centered really did not matter. His mathematics was universal and enabled him to build both models. And just, as an aside, the discussion referring to George Saliba was based on the fact that there is now growing proof that Copernicus took verbatim material and calculations and methods that Tusi had developed 300 years prior and did not credit Tusi. In fact, it wasn't just Tusi, it was Tusi and two of his fellow scholars, Urdi and Shatir, who had developed the mathematics. But going back to Tusi had developed his model. He knew there was an ample discussion going on amongst astronomers during the golden age of Islam about whether it's the sun or the earth that's at center. Tusi developed a model for both. His mathematics enabled him to do that. He then realized that if the earth was moving around the sun, I should be able to see the change in the positions of the stars. It's known as the parallax. And if your audience is interested in this, if you take your thumb, your hand, stretch it out, take a thumb, line it up with something, close one eye, line it up with something, and then without moving your head, hand, or hand, just open the eye you had closed and close the one that you had left open. You'll see your thumb will have moved off. That is an example of parallax. We would expect this to happen to the positions of the stars. Tusi did not see it. And he writes in his manuscript, he goes, I do not see this, therefore, there's no reason to think that the earth is moving. And then he says, that's a real, I'm paraphrasing, but you could almost see the word, he's sighing and saying, phew, or, in that sense. And I don't have to deal with the philosophers and the theologians now, because you could imagine in his head, right? If he had discovered that the earth was moving, the philosophers and the astronomers wouldn't have minded. No, they wouldn't have bothered too much about it. But the theologians would have gone crazy, even in the Muslim context. And so there was tension. The idea that there was no tension back then is a misperception. Haytham is a fantastic character. Haytham lived in Cairo. He was under the patronage of Imam al-Hakim. He was brought to Cairo as an engineer to build a dam, failed miserably at that, was afraid of presenting himself in the court to justify why he hadn't done anything. Meanwhile, he had written a magnus opus on optics that Newton later on referenced. But his greatest work, I think, was the creation of the scientific method. He amalgamated all the existing threads that had been floating around at the time, some coming from India, from one of the particular Hindu schools of thought, some coming from various regions of the Middle East and Central Asia, some coming from Greece, ancient Greece. He had pulled it all together and he had created this way of doing science, which involved things like exactly what we think about: hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, making mathematical models, and so on and so forth. I find that to be the signature contribution of Islamic scholars to modern science.
Thank you, Dr. Babul. Our next question is on Einstein. He shared that the most beautiful experiences we have is the mysterious one. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Whoever does not know it and can no longer wonder, no longer marvel, is as good as dead, and his eyes are dimmed. It was the experience of mystery, even if mixed with fear, that engendered religion. A knowledge of the existence of something we cannot penetrate, our perceptions of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which only in their most primitive forms are accessible to our minds. It is this knowledge and this emotion that constitute true religiosity. In this sense, I am deeply a religious man. Can you elaborate on what Einstein is saying here and this notion of mystery that is possibly reflected in God's nature?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can outline what Einstein had in mind when he was saying that, but I have a feeling, I sort of have a sense of understanding of what he might have been trying to say. Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah says something very similar in his memoirs. He talks about, in fact, I think he was talking about watching the sunset. And he talks about the fact that as this spectacle unfolds before you, if you can truly lose yourself in it, and then you feel this sense of wonder and awe and a sense of mystery, that there is something far greater that transcends you. And for a split second, or maybe for an eternity, who knows, you have this sense of it's hard to put it in words. I think that at that point, words start to fail us. But as a scientist, we come across those kinds of leaps, not every day, but there are occasions when it happens, when you are struggling and you can't see what you're trying to work your way through. And then all of a sudden, it feels like the veils just fall away. And this sense of realization comes over you and it sweeps you away. And it's a phenomenal feeling. And it's split seconds and you crave it. You want it again and you want it again. But it tells us that as human beings, there are experiences that we undergo, whether, I personally think it's internal, it's in the mind states. our mind states will suddenly settle into the state where you literally can feel the entire universe. And I think that that's a sense when people talk about being one. And it doesn't last. It's a horrible feeling when it breaks away. But craving that is and this is something very personal I'm describing. When I was, when the few times that I've been through this thing, I actually never told anybody I felt like this until I read a book by a fellow physicist. His name is Alan Lightman. And he started, in his book, he describes having similar experiences. And I thought, wait a minute, this is not so unusual. I think Einstein was talking in that sense, that as he was doing his studying, as he was trying to understand the universe, I'm sure there were aspects when suddenly things just clicked. And he could see in his head the entirety of the universe evolving. And he could see how things worked. He could see the warps and wefts of space-time in his head. And imagine what must have swept over him at that point, the euphoria and the joy. And remember, as physicists, we all believe, at the heart of it all, we believe that we live in a world that exists in a real sense, that there is a transcendent reality. What we are experiencing may be veiled, maybe aspects of it, maybe we're poking holes and just getting a glimpse of it. But there is, otherwise, this idea of law and order and harmony doesn't make sense. To be able to project back to the Big Bang and say with confidence that we ought to see the fireball of Big Bang, and then point a telescope and see it, that's remarkable. So Einstein has stated, and I have quoted it earlier, that the most incomprehensible thing about it all is that it is comprehensible. And I think that, when we talk about the apex human beings, I think that is a sense we can come back to, whether it is unique to Earth or whether there are other beings out there capable of doing that or not, I cannot say. I have no information, no data points to go on. If I was a betting person, I would say almost certainly there are other beings out there capable of achieving the same status. But it is the fact that we can do it, that we have the innate ability to be able to comprehend. That's amazing. That's just mind-blowing in a sense, right? And to be able to live in a world where you do that for a living, it has its moments of joy. Of course, when I have to write a grant, then it all falls away and becomes very painful. But those experiences make it all worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babul, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Unfortunately, we are out of time. However, we are deeply appreciative of all the questions that have come through during this critical conversation on science and faith. We do hope that this is just the start of this conversation. Today was such a treat for us, as I hope it was for you. Thank you again. A couple of announcements before you go. In the chat box, we have pasted some additional resources shared by the panelists. We will follow up with additional resources to all of the participants through email. For the recording of this conversation and past conversations, please visit the Facets of Faith page on the Ismaili USA. Please look out for more information on the Ismaili USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and the next critical conversation. Please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop out on your screen as you leave. Thank you so much, and Yali Madad.